Welcome to Back Away Slowly. As most of you know, we walk through the mysterious places, explore ominous folktales, and seek out strange creatures. We try to understand how these stories came to be, the effects they had on history, and still have on culture. All sources, social links, and more are available at backawayslowlypodcast.com. A warning that serious themes and language are used, so viewer discretion is advised. Welcome back to our monstrous deep dive. Halloween might be over, but I find that the ghostly and macabre is more of a lifestyle than a single holiday. In any case, I promised you all some crazy stories. If you didn't hear part 1, I'd really recommend listening to it first so that you know what we're talking about, as well as what this monster looks like. But now we go back to the early 1900s, and the monster that prowled the northeast of the United States. As a prelude to the main event of this episode, in the winter of 1905, 10-year-old Belva Brown was walking home with her mother and sister at about 8 o'clock at night. It was cold as they walked on the newly fallen snow, the full moon their guide. A soaring patch of night circled a nearby tree, glimpses of a creature passing into and out of the moonlight. The three stared at the bulky body, its slender head and pointed ears. They ran for their house, slamming the door. After some brief searching, they found their Boston Terrier quivering under the couch. Later, Belva Brown would say, quote, "I saw it, and I know what I've seen. I saw the Jersey Devil. That's no lie, it's authentic." Within minutes of the Brown lady's encounter, local teacher Mrs. Wilson saw the Jersey Devil swooping over the treetops of her own house. Several residents found odd footprints in the morning, including on the Browns' roof. Bernagot's postmaster, Rolfe Collins, made plaster casts of these prints, which are supposedly still in his daughter's possession. Up until this point, we've discussed an odd sighting here and there, but here is where things are really going to get wild. We're going to discuss as many notable sightings as I could find that occurred just over a single week of January 1909. Here's a bit of a heads up that a lot of sources don't agree on what day certain events happen. I tracked down as many newspaper articles from 1909 as I could to verify these dates, but I struggled to find much. I'm kind of guessing that 1, the Pine Barrens were viewed as just a small, insignificant corner of the United States at large and therefore weren't reported on frequently. And 2, the outside world clearly had an unsavory opinion of the people who lived in the area, hence the nickname Pineys, or Pine Rats. These people and their folklore, their devil living in the woods, was merely an example of their ignorance. So to reiterate, while I had numerous books that recount these events, some dates varied between them. With the limited newspapers that I had access to, I did my best to put these events in order. The first sign of something odd came from Mr. Cozens of Woodbury. He was leaving the Woodbury Hotel when he heard something strange. Quote, "I heard a hissing, and something white flew across the street. I saw 2 spots of phosphorus, the eyes of the beast. There was a white cloud, like escaping steam from an engine. It moved as fast as an auto." The 17th of January, 1909 was a Sunday, but just barely. It was 2 a.m. when Officer James Sackville, who would go on to become Bristol's chief of police, walked his beat on the cold, snowy streets of Bristol, Pennsylvania. The night was quiet as he took a leisurely stroll across the bridge, but I hope he enjoyed that peace while it lasted. A half-beast, half-bird came into view on the bridge. Sackville came to a stop, making eye contact with whatever it was. This thing let loose a blood-curdling scream before hopping away. Although stunned, Sackville managed to draw his gun and pursue the beast. This proved futile as the monster took to the sky and flew away. Sackville fired, but missed his mark. Nearby, Bristol's postmaster, E.W. Minster, had risen to find some cold water in an attempt to soothe his insomnia. As he looked out the window, he spotted the strange, long-necked flying creature fleeing Officer Sackville, soaring over the Delaware River. He managed to make out curled ram's horns on its head, and he thought it looked like a large crane, but it emitted a soft glow, like a firefly. He described its screaming as a cross between a squawk and a whistle as it soared away. The two men could only stare into the dark, completely unaware that this was just the start of the wildest and most inexplicable weeks that the area would ever see. Later that early morning, Joseph Bowden and his family were awoken by bizarre noises. Quote, whatever it was had circled the house and tried to get in through the back door before leaving. The family then found strange hoofed tracks in the snow leading to their garbage can. The contents had been half eaten. The Bowden family weren't the only ones hearing odd thumps in the night. John McOwen of Bath Street in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, awoke to his baby girl crying. He walked around the bedroom, soothing his vocally disgruntled child, but then paused as he heard odd noises outside, quote, like the scratching of a phonograph needle before the music begins. Looking out the window, he spotted a strange eagle-looking animal, hopping on the towpath along the Delaware Division Canal. Now, perhaps a few shared and separate sightings in the dark, paired with some creepy yet vague noises, could be waved away. But harder to deny were the countless strange tracks found in the light of day. Quote, hardly a backyard in Burlington was untouched by them. They seemed to climb trees, to skip from rooftop to rooftop, to lead into the street, only to vanish. They led across fields, over fences, into hard-to-reach places. They would appear for 20 yards or so, and then completely disappear. Two muskrat trappers, Clarence Williams and Charles Stupenze, followed some of these tracks around White City. They were more curious than tenacious, as they gave up following them after a mile. But regardless, Williams said, quote, I have never seen anything like it before. Gloucester City liveryman James Flesson found prints in 8 different yards, one of these trails leading into Andy McHugh's junkyard. After Mrs. Schindel found hoofprints in her yard, she claimed that she immediately knew the culprit. Quote, it's a 2-legged cow with wings. A newspaper reported that in Buck County, Pennsylvania, they tried to gather a posse to hunt this strange creature, but quickly dropped it when no one volunteered to go blindly hunting in the woods for God knows what. But other towns had more enthusiastic parties searching for the monster. Quote, curiously, dogs refused to follow the creature's trail, turning away in fear. Farmers set out hundreds of steel traps, but none were confirmed to be successful. After 2 days of odd sightings, chilling sounds, and innumerable tracks, residents of Burlington barred and bolted their doors, locked their windows, and refused to leave their homes, particularly after dark. A few people claimed they'd seen what they were calling the, quote, flying death, but refused to give their names for fear of ridicule from skeptics and their peers. The tracks in particular were incredibly confusing, and they were everywhere. A Burlington policeman spotted a flying, quote, jabberwock with glowing eyes, leaving behind 2-inch-long footprints a foot apart. When an officer Munchnoff heard that Officer Sackville failed to kill the Jersey Devil, he scoffed, quote, claiming that had he been on duty instead of Officer Sackville, he would have shot the Jersey Devil. Mr. and Mrs. Evans of Gloucester City, New Jersey, were jolted awake at about 2 to 2:30 a.m. on Tuesday, January 19th. The couple peeked out the window, and were met with the sight of the Jersey Devil dancing on their backyard shed. They watched in stunned silence as it continued to tap its way back and forth across the roof of their shed for the next 10 minutes. They would later describe the creature to the Philadelphia Public Ledger, quote, about 3.5 feet high, with a head like a collie dog and a face like a horse. It had a long neck, wings about 2 feet long, and its back legs were those of a crane, and it had horse's hooves. It walked on its back legs and held up 2 short front legs with paws on them. Eventually, Mr. Evans mustered up the courage to bravely open the window and scream, "Shoo!" The monster turned, barked at him, and flew away. Mrs. Evans added that the creature was vocally silent during its tap dancing routine, but when it flew away, the sound of its wings were described as such, quote, "It sounded like the muffled sounds a woods makes when it strikes a rotten place." I have no idea what she's alluding to, so make of that quote what you will. The next day, word of this encounter spread like wildfire, and hundreds of curious onlookers appeared in the Evans' yard. The couple graciously gave tours of their shed. The Fort Worth Star-Telegram also included the helpful bit of information that the jump that this animal would have had to have made to get to the shed roof was 18 feet. A few hours later, Daniel Flynn from Lieberville, Pennsylvania, saw the devil running along Chester Pike. He described it as 6 feet tall and with alligator skin. At 6 a.m., Mrs. Ryan of Burlington saw the Jersey Devil prowling in an alley. She said that the creature had long, bird-like legs, a horse's head, as well as short wings. The trails of tracks continued to baffle all who saw them, particularly hunters and trackers. Gloucester muskrat hunters Hank White and Tom Hamilton tenaciously followed a set of tracks for 20 miles. Quote, "They were amazed to see the trail jump 5-foot fences and squeeze under 8-inch spaces." William Pine's daughter was carrying a dinner pail to her father in Camden. She spotted these strange tracks and, fearing an imminent attack, fell into a faint. I assume that the girl was already nervous, if not outright terrified, what with the rumors of a monster prowling the area and the tracks everywhere. Seeing these tracks must have implied to her that this monster was nearby, scaring her badly enough that she blacked out. And we also don't know how old this girl was. Her father arrived to care for his daughter and examined the tracks, observing that they resembled donkey's tracks. These footprints clearly came from an animal with 2 limbs, one having been larger than the other, potentially deformed. Reports from Swedesboro claimed that the Jersey Devil had antlers. A Glassboro witness said that the devil had 2 toes and was dog-like. Early in the morning of Wednesday, January 20th, an unidentified Burlington policeman saw the devil, saying it, quote, "had no teeth. Its eyes were like blazing coals." This officer was sure that it was a, quote, "Jabberwock." 2 search parties gathered in Haddonfield, one led by Dr. Glover, the other led by Mr. Holloway. Both parties found a good deal of tracks, but they always ended abruptly, implying to them that the creature had taken flight. Another posse popped up in Collingswood, led by Station Agent Kirkwood. They supposedly saw the Jersey Devil, but only a glimpse as it headed north to Moorestown. Well, there seems to be some accuracy to this claim, because the Jersey Devil was then spotted near the Mount Carmel Cemetery of Moorestown. John Smith, wisely or not, chased the beast until it lost him at a nearby gravel pit. Nearby George Snyder was blissfully fishing when he was interrupted by a 3-foot-tall, black-furred creature. Snyder said that it had arms and hands like a monkey, a face like a dog, split hooves, and a foot-long tail. At Riverside, prints were found particularly around chicken coops and outhouses. Dog lovers, brace yourselves. Joseph Mans found the tracks around the body of his deceased puppy. Justice Ziegler sent Officer Burton to investigate these incidents, especially since he found footprints in his own backyard. Well, Mr. Ziegler was nothing if not analytical and methodic. He quickly made half a dozen plaster casts of the 2.5 by 1.25 inch prints. Waves of people visited Ziegler's office to behold these molds. These excited guests then attempted to demand to see the actual tracks at his home. Most Riverside residents insisted that this was the work of a, quote, one-legged, one-footed creature, certainly not made by any human person. By this point, there were sightings of the Jersey Devil in eastern Pennsylvania, Wilmington, Delaware, Maryland, and even the occasional report from Canada or even California. Later in the evening, a Salem, New Jersey policeman spotted the, quote, devil bird that had one horse leg and one mule leg. It also had a single horn and an ostrich tail, the entire beast stretching to 11 feet long. That night in Camden, housewife Mary Sabinski heard her dog yelping in the backyard. She ran out to see the imposing figure of the Jersey Devil clutching her dog in its claws. Like any loyal dog owner, she grabbed the closest thing to her, beating the shit out of a winged, alligator-skinned kangaroo monster with a broom until it dropped her dog. The beast let out a snarl that was described as a combination of the, quote, hoot of an owl and the, quote, snarl of a hyena. Though I'm not sure how familiar people from 1909 in Northeast America were with the sound of a hyena, but I digress. It flew up and over Mrs. Sorbinski, cresting the fence. With the threat gone, the woman carried her wounded dog into the house, screaming in shock and panic, and understandably so. The monster had taken a chunk out of her dog. Over 100 neighbors and curious locals flooded the house and yard, crowding the poor Mrs. Sorbinski. Patrolman Thomas Cunningham and William Crouch of the Camden Police arrived. In the middle of this mess and commotion, all froze when a piercing shriek rang out from a nearby hill. Spilling out of the house, the mob saw the Jersey Devil standing innocently on the water tower. The group stampeded towards the hill. The two policemen emptied their guns at the creature, who decided to hang around to watch this circus. But yet again, it took flight, uninjured, and moved on. And look, I'm nothing if not an animal lover, so I went digging for the 1909 newspaper that wrote about this incident. I'm incredibly relieved to report that yes, while the dog had a chunk taken out of it, it quickly revived when it was brought back into the house. "1 a.m. Thursday morning. The Black Hawk Social Club in Camden, New Jersey, was having a very late-night meeting. A member of this club, John Rowe, heard an odd sound at the back window. Poor boy was probably expecting to see a deer, a raccoon, or maybe even a stray dog. As he walked to the glass, peering out into the pitch black of the new morning, his gaze locked with the glowing eyes of the Jersey Devil. Rowe screamed in terror, grabbing a club on instinct. The rest of the group rushed to his aid, but the monster was gone. Public service railway trolley car operator Edward Davis of Burlington was running the trolley past Haddon Heights at 2 in the morning when a winged kangaroo with a long neck darted across the tracks in front of the car, glimpsed in the headlights before vanishing into the darkness. A passenger cried out, "There's that thing! Take it away!" The terrified passengers, yet not so terrified as to not crowd the windows, jostled to see this monster. Davis's description shared many similarities with the others. Quote, "In general appearance, it resembled a kangaroo. It has a long neck, and from what glimpse I got of its head, its features are hideous. It has wings of a fairly good size, and, of course, in the darkness looked black. Its legs are long and somewhat slender, and were held in such a position as a swan's when it is flying. We all tried to get a look at its feet to see what shape they were, but the darkness was too great. It looked to be about 4 feet high. The creature flew along the trolley for about 200 yards before circling overhead, hissing loudly and flying away. But the Jersey Devil had places to be. A lot of places to be. It flew north, landing on the road opposite of the Trenton Driving Park. William Cromley was finally returning home after a very late night as a doorkeeper for the Trent Theater. Suddenly, his horse jerked back, panicked. Cromley leapt down to try to calm the animal and determine the cause of the horse's distress. But that immediately became evident. In front of them was, quote, a beast of fur and feathers, about the size of a dog with the face of a German shepherd, from which glowed large, sparkling eyes. Fortunately for Cromley and his horse, the beast hissed at them, spread its wings, and flew away. The devil continued its rampage, forcefully trying to enter the second-floor window of Trenton City Councilman E.P. Whedon's home. Flinging open the window, Whedon heard flapping wings and spotted cloven hoofprints deep in the snow on his roof. On the 400th block of Center Street, Mrs. Batten found footprints on her windowsills and doors. She barricaded herself in the house, proclaiming that she wouldn't leave her home until the beast was gone for certain. At 6 a.m., Mrs. Ryan heard an unusual noise in the alleyway, so she opened the shutters of her home on Penn Street in Burlington. She saw, quote, a peculiar-shaped body and long, bird-like legs, while its head looked like a horse. Its short wings seemed to be partially spread, and it was stooping, as if about to leap. Terrified, Mrs. Ryan slammed the windows closed and collapsed in a chair. While frozen in shock for a while, she eventually managed to wake her youngest son, Edward, as her husband was at work already. Edward poked his head out and, confirming that there was no monster in the alley, left to catch a train. However, when the neighbors heard of this, they investigated more carefully and found pony-like prints leading to the fence. Daniel Flynn was walking along Chester Pike in Leaperville, Pennsylvania on the way to work. The Jersey Devil sprinted out of a nearby yard and, catching sight of Flynn, ran up the pike, quote, on its hind legs faster than the speed of an automobile. He also reported that the monster had alligator skin, as well as being about 6 feet tall. William Wasso was a track walker on the electric railway between Clayton and Newfield, and he saw a very interesting figure on the tracks that day. The Jersey Devil bent down curiously to sniff the rail. Its tail drooped to touch it, and bang! The contact made an explosion that melted 20 feet of track on all sides. Such an explosion must have killed the monster, people insisted. It had been blown to smithereens. Phone company lineman Theodore Hackett was out working with a few other men about 5 miles from Pleasantville. Another lineman named Howard Campbell walked a little ways into the woods, distracted by something running down the path towards him. Fortunately, he didn't just stand and gape. He sprinted for the nearest telegraph pole, screaming and whooping. Frightened beyond all reason, Campbell climbed up one of the poles and threw himself on the wires strung between 2 poles. Hackett and some other crew members arrived to rescue him, Hackett firing upon the charging beast. According to the report, his shot broke a wing, which drooped to the ground, the monster screaming. It hopped and ran, dragging its wing into the pine thicket. Too stunned to pursue, and with a companion to rescue, the gang quickly gathered some ropes to get Campbell down from the wires. In all of the excitement and terror of the incident, Hackett could only say that the thing had a horse's head, bat's wings, and a tail like a rat's, only a lot longer. Despite this account claiming that the Jersey Devil had been injured, it didn't seem to slow it down, and the chase continued. Daybreak proved to be painful for many poultry farmers. Countless chickens were either missing or found dead with no marks on them. Farmers were stumped. Were they strangled to death? Or did they die of fright? Well, whatever the reason, it was unanimously agreed that it was 100% the Jersey Devil, and this madness had to stop. What did that entail? Well, it would take time for people to come up with all sorts of plans, but in the meantime, the devil had more sightseeing planned. In Westville, a women's meeting had gathered. 2 of these women were staring out at the peaceful, snowy field when something horrific, and by now familiar, came into view. The meeting quickly dispersed, but one of them called Harry Doughton. Doughton quickly assembled a posse, complete with dogs and guns. They arrived to track the creature, following it to a trail through the woods of Washington Park, but there it was again lost. 4 p.m. in Philadelphia saw the Jersey Devil soaring over the southern part of the city. Mrs. White of the 1500 block of Ellsworth Street stepped outside to collect her clothesline. She caught sight of something stooped in the corner of her yard. Curious, she started over to investigate it, but as she approached, it rose to tower over her, 6 feet tall. She was close enough to see its alligator skin. That is, she noticed this in the moments she had before it breathed fire. Insurance agent Mr. White was woken by his wife's screams, emerging into the yard. There he found his wife unconscious on the ground, a monster ripped from nightmares, breathing fire over her. A true husband of the year, Mr. White grabbed a nearby clothes prop, thinking only of saving his wife. He ran at the beast, swinging. This seemed to surprise and spook the Jersey Devil. It scuttled over the fence and into the alley leading to 16th Street, still shooting flames. Mr. White immediately stopped his pursuit, instead returning to call a doctor to help his wife. It took over an hour to revive the poor woman, though she fortunately hadn't been struck or harmed by the monster. She'd fainted from fright. Well, on 16th Street, a poor motorman had no way of knowing that Mr. White had chased a monster down the alley and right into his path. The shaken motorman reported having almost run over a grotesque, fire-breathing creature near Washington Avenue, near the same time as the White couple's incident. Charles Kloss and George Boggs were taking a casual evening stroll down Grant Avenue. But then they saw a large, unfamiliar ornament adorning the fire chief's roof. An ostrich. They said that what they thought was an ostrich was on top of the fire chief's home. Well, whatever it was, something had to be done. Believe it or not, Kloss and Boggs were actually concerned about this animal, so they triggered a fire alarm. I don't know, it sounds like that would be the quickest way to startle an animal into falling off of the roof, but whatever. The fire department arrived to fetch this treed cat, so to speak, only to recognize this oversized bird as the monster that had been terrorizing the town. Well, they'd found it, but what did they do now? So this was how the fire department ended up blasting the Jersey Devil with a fire hose to dislodge him off of the fire chief's roof. To their credit, it worked. He glided away from the water, drifting to the ground about 150 feet away. Things were going well, until the possible, literal spawn of Satan slowly turned around and charged at the fire department. Panicking, the men threw sticks, rocks, and anything else they could grab at the rampaging devil, but to no effect. It bore down on the men and suddenly took flight, barely soaring over them and vanishing yet again. As you can imagine, the panic had grown into a frenzy in these communities and their neighbors. Trenton and New Brunswick trolleys were assigned armed drivers to ward off attacks. There were so many trails of unknown tracks that ministers of the town churches reported a very noticeable increase in attendance the next Sunday. One source says that the tracks were so numerous and roebling that witnesses described it as looking like a herd of Shetland ponies had trampled through the area. The terror was so bad that businesses, schools, theaters, and restaurants closed until the Jersey Devil could be dealt with. Night shifts in Gloucester City were shut down because nobody would leave their home at night. That night in Wycombe, a group of men milled about, debating about the laundry list of crazy incidents that had been going on in the Delaware Valley. Most men had read the Doylestown Daily Republican, and they agreed that this was all the result of, quote, an excellent supply of Jersey Applejack that year. Everyone was cackling at this theory when a scream ripped through the air from Thompson's lumberyard. The laughter died in their throats, and they all watched in horror as a, quote, monster, part animal, part bird, part buzzard, circled over them several times before departing. They were in such shock that they couldn't even agree on how large it had been. Some claimed it was 9 feet long. Others said it was 20 feet, with fiery eyes, long wings, feathers, and teeth that were inches long. Quote, there was one thing on which all the men in the group did agree. The Daily Republican was wrong in its assessment of the Jersey Devil. At 10:30 at night, a, quote, respected Chester citizen heard odd noises on the shed roofs of Robinson's brickyard. The streetlights illuminated a figure soaring through the fog, a half-beast, half-bird, with wings like a bat and a long tail that was tipped with a point like an arrow. This citizen watched it soar just over a set of elevated railroad tracks right as the northbound express was passing. The engineer furiously blasted his whistle, but the Jersey Devil was already gone. Not long after this, the devil soared over City Hall, landing near a school at 3rd and Jeffrey Streets. Several policemen chased it up Commerce Street, where it vanished into the fog of Thomas Marshall's funeral parlor's backyard. All that the policemen found for their troubles was a good deal of footprints and a few neighbors reporting the sound of flapping wings and stomping feet. I don't know when the Jersey Devil got any sleep, but it wasn't Friday morning. At 2 a.m. on the 22nd, the Jersey Devil landed on the roof at the corner of Ferry Avenue and Van Hook Street, waking its residents. Mrs. Stenberg shook her husband awake. He leapt for his rifle, but wasn't fast enough to shoot the creature before it was gone again. 2 hours later, Camden policeman Louis Strayer spotted a, quote, jabberwock, getting a drink from a horse trough in front of John Carroll's saloon on 3rd Street. He got a good enough look to be able to describe a kangaroo head and body, deer antlers, and bat wings. At dusk, 2 young women were returning home near Chester, Pennsylvania. The Jersey Devil darted out of a boxcar, sailing close to the terrified women, before again vanishing. At 7 p.m., saloon keeper C.C. Hilk of Lamberton Street, Trenton, got a phone call that announced that they'd done it. The Jersey Devil was locked in his farm's barn across the Delaware River in Morrisville, Pennsylvania. Apparently, the devil had caught a ride on a wagon that was driven into the barn by a farmhand. Several men slammed the door shut, celebrating the beast's capture. A good number of expectant and curious locals even rowed a boat across the Delaware to witness this event, but the Jersey Devil had somehow managed to escape from the barn. The devil flew south to Salem, where night watchman Jacob Henderson heard a commotion. He found a bulldog owned by Mrs. Brown driving the devil from the backyard. Local papers weren't helping the rising panic. The Morning Call from Paterson, New Jersey, wrote, quote, in the meantime, from every town in South Jersey come reports of dogs torn to pieces, blood-curdling encounters, and descriptions that fit any prehistoric monster one might pick out. Lots of these come from reputable people who are firmly convinced they saw what they say they did. The next day, the Evening Star paper announced, quote, New Jersey's bogey. The paper described the terror gripping Burlington, New Jersey, that a creature named the, quote, Leeds Devil, or the, quote, Flying Hoof, had been harassing the area for 5 days, but in an incredibly rude and dismissive way. Quote, it is a menace only insofar as the thousands of African Americans and untutored whites hereabouts are generally alarmed, attributing to its supernatural powers. Some persons refuse to go out at night. Farmers' children are timid. Nervous women in the villages wait until daylight before unbolting their doors. Apparently, 120 of their 200 African American workers refused to clock into their shifts at the Hainesport Iron Works, but the paper attributed this to the colony's obsession with superstitious traditions. But then the writer had to begrudgingly admit that, despite attempts to ridicule the rumors of this creature to death, these efforts had the opposite effect. Highly respected men in several communities had made, quote, extravagant statements, and, quote, the ignorant have accepted the veracity of the stories. Well, the Jersey Devil was definitely calming down, but it still had a few more antics planned. Milkman William Thompson was driving his wagon to Wilmington for morning deliveries at the frankly criminal hour of 4 a.m. Near the gate of Shallot Park, he saw what he thought was a calf. That is, until it stood up on its hind legs. A, quote, long neck, long tail, long nose, short forelegs with claws at the end, and long back legs upon which it was sitting. It was shaped like a kangaroo, and its red eyes gleamed through the dark. Curious, he drove a bit closer, but stopped when the Jersey Devil barked like a dog, charging his milk wagon. Thompson urged his horse to speed to the city. By the time Thompson turned back, the monster was bounding up Penny Hill, but Thompson didn't stop until he and his poor horse reached 10th and Market Streets in downtown Wilmington. Tracks were found all over Wilmington that morning, and Wilmington's paper, the Morning News, was quick to announce, quote, the monster has arrived. This was unhelpful, as it stirred the already jumpy population. Leonard Lynch, Charles McGoey, and John Chambers of the Union Fire Company were at work when they heard a strange noise coming from the old barn by the firehouse. No prizes for guessing what they found. The Jersey Devil sprang at least 25 feet over the ticket office of a nearby baseball park and disappeared. The only things left, other than 3 stunned men, was a half-eaten pumpkin and mysterious footprints. The Jersey Devil had had its week of fun, and according to James McCloy in Ray Miller's book The Jersey Devil, it was only seen one more time for the rest of 1909. In late February, outside of Salem, Leslie Garrison was heading home at sunset. As he crossed a stone bridge near Schultz's store, he saw a strange, peculiar-looking, and very large bird soaring over a clump of trees. Garrison said, quote, it had legs 5 to 6 feet long, stretched horizontally, and at the extremities were feet which resembled a man's. Which, honestly, this monster having human feet is somehow the most horrifying detail to me. Garrison concluded his account, quote, it must be the flying devil that everyone had been talking about. One thing was for certain. Where the Jersey Devil had been sneered at, disregarded, and viewed as an old wives' tale for decades, now it would take generations to dim the memories of that terrifying week. This collection of incidents is something I've never encountered with any other cryptid. This creature that we aren't even sure exists managed to shut down multiple entire communities. People locked themselves inside of their homes, not from a natural disaster or a murderer on the loose, but from a bizarre patchwork zoo of a monster. I didn't even mention all of the encounters that I'd found. If I had, there would be 2 more episodes, and frankly, they get really repetitive. When questioned about his thoughts on the incident, W.H. Cantrell of Philadelphia said, quote, now I hate to talk about this. All the fellows at the office will be laughing at me, but the tracks are there, sure enough. I'll wager, too, that the thing that made the tracks walked on 2 legs. So yeah, what on earth happened during that January? A few theories arose to explain this remarkable series of events, some even more fantastical than the beast itself. Where many saw a fascinating mystery, a few saw an opportunity for themselves. and so the theories would be matched by the hoaxes that popped up all over the place. But we still have many years of encounters to go, so we'll save the theories and hoaxes for after our remaining reports. A Vineland resident recounted that in the 1910s, his father, who'd been around 15 at the time, was driving his horse and buggy along a Vineland road. His horse stopped suddenly, and as he looked around, he felt the air get very hot. As he turned back to the road, the Jersey Devil itself was standing in their path. It was 4 to 5 feet tall, glowing red all over. They stared at each other for a moment before the Jersey Devil ran off. At first, I thought that the warming air was a reference to the Jersey Devil's ability to breathe fire, but this account seems to describe the entire animal glowing like a red-hot poker. It's the first and only time I've come across this description, and it is a pretty dramatic visual. Captain and sailor David Higby of Haddonfield recounted an event in his childhood, specifically in 1911. Quote, "Late in the afternoon on a Saturday in mid-February, my brother and I saw small hoof prints in the snow near my aunt's home. We followed these prints down to a creek on the edge of the woods. There on the bank of the creek was this animal. It was the size of a small pony, with a head somewhat like a horse, but its body was very long and it had a shaggy fur coat. Its legs were short. As we fearfully approached, it jumped the creek and disappeared into the woods." In 1912, a pair of fishermen were off the coast of Brigantine, New Jersey. They were collecting their nets when said nets pulled up a 5-foot-long monster. They wrestled it on board, bringing it back to shore to a bewildered crowd. Quote, "With its physical strength and rows of menacing teeth, it seemed, they said, a cross between an alligator and the Jersey Devil, which several years ago gave the entire eastern states a fright." Here we see that the events of 1909 were clearly still on the public's mind, though I see nothing in this specific creature's descriptions that imply that this animal was anything other than a possibly lost and incredibly confused alligator. Bessie Carr Losasso of Chatsworth was one of 13 children. Her father struggled to support so many children on as little as $1.25 a week, scrounging together every cent by picking blueberries, gathering moss, and splitting wood. It was about 1 p.m. in 1914 when Bessie and 7 other children were playing in the woods when a deaf-mute child pointed into the woods. Quote, "As the other children looked through the trees, an ugly, threatening creature emerged and walked to within 4 feet of the children. The creature stood on his hind feet, which were each a foot long. His forepaws were short, with hooked hands, and he held them limply in front of his chest, similar to a kangaroo. Bessie described the Jersey Devil as about 4.5 feet tall, fluffy, with a long and rat-like tail, a grotesque face with a flattened nose like a pig, and 2 large horns sprouting from the top of his head. To add to his eerie, supernatural quality, the devil was dragging chains, which clashed as he moved. Years later, while driving in the vicinity of Chatsworth, the mother of one of the children saw the creature who precisely fitted the description provided by her frightened daughter years before. 1917. The Jersey Devil is spotted slinking around a frozen pond in the area of Valley Pond, New Jersey. The poor skaters scrambled to the shores, fleeing from the monster in the shadows of the skeletal trees. In that same year, the Jersey Devil is reported to have chased people up and down the streets of Bernagot. 2 years later, in August, Lena Bergeson claims that she stumbled upon the Jersey Devil in her chicken coop. She and a neighbor stabbed it to death with pitchforks, beating on the poor thing until it was dead. Quote, "They said it had the head of a squirrel, a body the size of a large dog, and looked like a possum." 1920 was a decently busy year for the Jersey Devil. Yet more fishermen on the coast had battled another devil, this one with 8 flexible arms like an octopus. Further inland, a farmer claimed it had eaten his chickens. Quote, "It had a head like a pig and eyes like a parrot, with a tail like a squirrel." In Salem, a posse drove the Jersey Devil up a tree, but it managed to escape. Yet another posse chased down a, quote, "flying lion" in West Orange, claiming they'd captured one of its cubs. In the 1920s, the source doesn't have an exact year, a young boy and his friend were biking down a narrow Pinelands trail that linked 2 small towns. Quote, "As they pedaled along rapidly, they realized that something was keeping pace with them in the dense woods, at a distance of 6 to 8 feet parallel to the road. It would have been difficult enough for anyone running on the road to keep up with the bicycles, but this something was running through thick woods and underbrush. As they pedaled along, the young man and his friend caught glimpses of the creature. It was large and man-like, and its strange, loud breathing sent an eerie chill through them. The faster the terrified boys rode, the faster the Jersey Devil ran to keep abreast of them. The chase continued all the way to town. The frightened bicyclists both stated, quote, "It had to be the Jersey Devil." Many years later, the son of one of the bicyclists was camping with his wife and 3 children in the New Jersey State Forest. They heard a strange noise and realized something was close to their tent, breathing so heavily it sounded like blasts of steam. The family felt a strong sense of fear, which our informant says is a characteristic of any encounter with the Jersey Devil. Eventually, however, the creature retreated back into the woods. In 1925, Hyman Wyman of Greenwich Township in Gloucester County found the Jersey Devil again after its favorite snack. Desperate not to lose all of his chickens, Hyman pursued and supposedly shot the devil dead. He ended up displaying the body, which was published in the Woodbury Daily Times. Quote, "Hyman said it was as big as an Airedale, with black fur, and it hopped like a kangaroo. Its front legs, he said, were longer than the rear, which were short and crouched, the hind feet having 4 webbed toes. Its yellow eyes were open in death, and Hyman said, quote, its jaw is neither dog, wolf, nor coyote." He added an odd detail about its teeth. Quote, "Its crushers in the lower jaws have 4 prongs, into which the upper teeth fit perfectly." Later in October, Morrill Langley found a body in a tree on Franklinville Road outside of Swedesboro. Quote, "The body, which appeared to have been dead for about a month, was 2.5 feet long and 1 foot high. Its back feet and legs resembled those of a cat, and its front legs looked something like those of a monkey. The creature's mouth was a bony structure." Langley turned the body over to Harry Finzer of Franklinville, who intended to present the body to the University of Pennsylvania for an autopsy. Like so many other accounts of the Jersey Devil, this is where the story ends. The book Phantom of the Pines writes that in 1927, quote, "A taxi driver heading towards Salem late one night was forced to stop to repair a flat tire. Just as he finished, his taxi began to shake violently. There, something that stood upright like a man, but without clothing and covered in hair, had its huge hands on his vehicle. He jumped into the taxi and sped off in fright, abandoning the jack and flat tire, and not stopping until he reached Salem, where he told his harrowing story to Edward R. Jones and Bill Reed, who bravely drove out to have a look for themselves, leaving the shaken taxi driver back in town. Jones and Reed retrieved the flat tire, but the Jersey Devil had once again melted back into the surrounding woods. Berry pickers in both Mays Landing and Leeds Point encountered the Jersey Devil in July 1930. One Mays Landing motorist reported that a completely terrified man attempted to jump into his car, claiming the Jersey Devil was pursuing him. At about the same time that day, Howard Marcy and John Hunsinger observed the Jersey Devil not far from their homes in Ariel. They said the beast had the, quote, body of a man, head of a cow, large bat-like wings, big feet, and flew up into the air, and then cut the tops off trees. Strangely, Marcy's 12-year-old daughter Kathy and Huntsinger's daughter Jacqueline saw the same thing at exactly the same place some unspecified time after that. The Coatesville Record of Chester County ran the headline, quote, "Jersey Devil roaming at large in Lindell area excites neighborhood," on the 21st of January, 1932. Swarthmore nurseryman John McCandles was directing a work crew from Upper Bank Nurseries of Media to dig up trees when they heard a groaning sound from the other side of a small ridge. The men were terrified when the Jersey Devil, quote, "jumped over a high clump of bushes and came at them." McCandles and one other man ran to a nearby farmhouse and borrowed a shotgun. Quote, "The farmer told them he had seen the thing prowling about his property in the moonlight several weeks before, but he had been too terrified to shoot at it." McCandles and the worker returned to the site, where they found mysterious tracks in the mud, but again, the creature was gone. Quote, McCandles later told the Daily Local News, quote, "It was about the height of a man and was without clothing of any kind. Its skin was a yellowish gray in color, and its face was more horrible than that of any animal I have ever seen pictured. Its head, hands, and feet appeared to be unusually large, and it stood partially erect when walking. I could not say whether it was man or beast." The workman with McCandles exclaimed, quote, "Man, that wasn't nothing human. It growled and groaned like a wildcat. Made chills run up and down your back just to hear it. It didn't walk either. It crawled, and it crawled mighty fast." That is terrifying. That is awful. Oh my god. The next day, McCandles, Josiah Hooper, and the workmen returned to the site, armed of a search. They covered the entire area, but were unable to find anything. This incident would spark national interest, leading to 4 newspapermen banding together to launch their own investigation. This little crew was formed more as a response to the popularity of the monster rather than any actual belief. Indeed, the gang oozed a mix of skepticism and humor as they marched through the woods, carrying an antique sword, just in case. They swaggered through the trees chanting, oh where is the phantom at? Oh where can he be?" They proclaimed that they sought, quote, "to personally interview His Satanic Majesty the Jersey Devil, or the member of his royal household said to inhabit this peculiar section of Chester County." Growing tired of their little performance, they retired from the woods, caked head to toe in mud. I do find this incident important to include, as it gives a bit of a peek into the attitudes of everyone outside of the Pine Barrens. The surrounding areas simply viewed this merely as an entertaining example of hysterical backwoods gossip, reporting on it as such. I've included some newspapers from that time period about the Jersey Devil, but even the ones I couldn't fit in wrote in a particularly condescending way about the people in the area. In 1932, 1935, and 1936, the Jersey Devil is chased by armed groups of men, managing to escape every time. In May 1937, the Jersey Devil is sighted by numerous residents. They would later connect this sighting to the Hindenburg disaster. The devil had fulfilled its role as harbinger of doom once again. In the late 1930s, the Jersey Devil could be heard clomping across the Lower Bank Bridge during full moons. However, we also start to see hints at an almost Robin Hood-esque nature, as it was also rumored in the late 1930s that the Jersey Devil was giving out food to those in need during the Depression. The Jersey Devil appears as a warning of the Pearl Harbor attack on December 7, 1945. Later on in November, the Record of Coatesville, Pennsylvania publishes the headline, quote, "Jersey Devil returns for a little visit." The reaction was immediate and dramatic. Armed posses began to assemble. There were incidents of weapons being fired, and even a car accident related to the panic. Chickens and turkeys began to disappear. The body of a gray fox was found. People began to wildly claim that it must be a panther. However, state game protector of Chester County, Peter Filkowski, said that there's been no panthers in the area for over 50 years. Thomas Rhodes spotted the monster and described it as a creature, quote, larger than a fox, with a sleek black coat, long body, short and pointed ears, and a long, thin tail. Claude Reinhardt of Pottstown said the Jersey Devil sounded like a screaming man. Quote, most people who have heard the devil sounds characterized them as somewhere between the screams of a man and the cries of a baby. That's upsetting. John Womack of Pottstown saw the creature and said, quote, it bounded away in leaps of at least 10 feet in length each. Admittedly, these details do sound like a panther. A sleek, long body, a long, thin tail, the sounds of a screaming man. However, black mountain lions or panthers don't exist. What people call black panthers are actually melanistic leopards or jaguars. It's possible that it could be an escaped exotic, which happened a lot more than you'd think, but even then, melanism only occurs in about 10% of jaguar and leopard populations, so it would be rare even by exotic standards. As far as a scream that sounds like a man, lynx and foxes make a variety of vocalizations that would be incredibly alarming to hear at night, but it really depends on the sound that these witnesses heard. Well, whatever it was, nothing seemed to be able to stop the hysteria. Parents picked up their children from school, keeping them inside at night. If I try to consider it from their perspective, I kind of understand. While almost everyone grows up with a version of the boogeyman, very few can boast that hundreds of people from all kinds of backgrounds have seen it within a contained area. These parents would have grown up hearing about their own parents' first-hand encounters with their local monster. That's terrifying. But then some citizens began to get aggressive in their fear, and soon things got out of hand. A group of men searched the woods until 3:30 in the morning, the first of a series of posses. These posses led to many discharged rounds, fired at shadows. Mrs. Krieger at Sheep Hill got so tired of the frequent sounds of gunfire that she said, quote, maybe I'll start shooting some myself if this nonsense doesn't stop. Predictably, the injury reports began to roll in. William J. Brandel, 18, of Pottstown, was shot in the thigh. Betty Hart, 17, of Douglasville, was shot in the left arm. A group of youths were motoring down a small road in search of the Jersey Devil when they were surprised by the dead end to the road. Too late to pull away, the vehicle smashed into the barrier at the end of the lane, hopped a 5-foot embankment, and slammed to a halt. Ivan Lemon Jr., 18, and Irene Petzer, 21, of Pottstown were treated at the hospital for cuts, brush burns, and a split lip. The fun of a monster hunt, the promise of glory at being the one to shoot said monster, and just having a fun night out with the guys, those guys probably being fueled on a good deal of alcohol, made for predictably disastrous results. Who needs a monster to terrorize the town when you have mobs of 16 to 21-year-old boys with guns and cars? The wilding hordes got so bad that police started to search cars coming into the area for firearms. The police themselves tried to set an example by instead laying out bear traps. Shockingly, the police had nothing to show from this half-hearted attempt at capture, but I do think they were successful at preventing any accidental deaths. On Thursday, the 22nd of November, 1951, a group of children were hanging out at the DuPont Clubhouse at the edge of town. A 10-year-old boy was passing a window when he saw the thing staring in at him, quote, blood coming out of its face. The boy started screaming uncontrollably, falling to the floor, his body seizing. This fit was so bad that his screams were reported to have been heard at the edge of town. The chaperone managed to calm him, and the children returned to their games. The chaperone, the boy's brothers, and the other children discounted his story, but another sighting of the devil was reported, this time the police being called. They searched the area but found no trace. The next night, Ronald Jones and a group of teenagers hunted for the creature in the area. While unsuccessful at tracking the creature down, they did hear unearthly screams. A Mrs. Weiser corroborated the group's claims, also having heard a, quote, shrill, unearthly scream from the woods. Nearby, Jerry Ray was combing the area with some other boys. He claimed that, quote, it almost grabbed him, and that, quote, it had a wild look in his eyes. Not the most descriptive sighting, especially while saying that it was close enough to grab him, but okay. Speaking of its appearance, the witnesses that did describe the creature couldn't seem to agree. Quote, some said it was 7 feet tall with an ugly face. One said it was half man, half beast. Others depicted it as a, quote, chunky man with a bestial face. Trying to get a handle on the situation, stop more vigilantes, and stem the flood of calls from frightened residents, Chief of Police Louis Silvestro took some men out into the bush with floodlights. This clearly did next to nothing, as on Monday morning, the students at the Gibbstown schools were so worked up that Principal Clarence Morgan called in Chief Silvestro to calm them down. The chief tried to stop flocking tourists by placing signs on the outskirts of Gibbstown that bluntly stated that the Jersey Devil was a hoax, which only seemed to draw more attention than anything else. Quote, around the same time, the Jersey Devil was accused of attacking dogs in the vicinity of Jackson Mills. A terrier was torn to pieces, its hind legs eaten away by something having a, quote, terrible yell, and 2 other dogs were badly mauled. One resident bravely decided to investigate the source of these terrible screams and maulings. He waited one night in the darkness, equipped for his defense with a broomstick. His flashlight caught sight of a being for a fleeting moment, but then the light died. He describes the creature as, quote, sort of a wildcat, 4 feet tall and long and grayish. Ultimately, there's really no conclusion to these sightings in Gibbstown. Nothing was caught, so in the end, there wasn't much to be done. The only result was that the Jersey Devil was revived yet again in the living memory of the area. In October of 1957, a massive forest fire raged through the Wharton State Forest. Once it had been put out, a State Department of Conservation forester found some odd burned remains at Hampton Furnace. Quote, the remains consisted of a partial skeleton, claws, feathers, bone particles, and hind legs of some unrecognizable creature. Despite having so many pieces of whatever it was, no one could identify it. Despite no report ever having been issued about this mystery animal, the local authorities were so desperate to prevent another fiasco like Gibbstown, they put up more signs that said, quote, the Jersey Devil is a hoax. While some agreed that these remains were a hoax, others believed it to finally be the end of the Jersey Devil. Or so they thought. In this desire to crack down on vigilante groups, a Wall Township judge fined a group of 30 boys who had been out monster hunting with real guns. This fine was for a whopping $50, which is about $542 in October of 2024. So the price of 30 kids running around with live weapons would be the equivalent of about $20 per kid today. In 1960, 2 deer hunters were swapping stories as they camped in the woods, mostly disbelief and disdain for the Jersey Devil stories. One of the hunters went to put out the fire, but a strong gust of wind blew it out. After a moment of silence, terrible screams erupted about 300 feet to their left. When they looked, they saw a bluish mist drifting closer with 2 piercing red eyes in the center. As it got closer, they saw the outline of huge wings. One of the hunters ran for their car on a small dirt road several hundred yards away, the other hunter sprinting into the woods. The hunter running to the car heard something crashing through the woods behind him. He threw himself into the driver's seat, speeding off, but he felt something thump into the back of his car. He drove to the nearest bar and called the police, who were skeptical when they heard a large, winged creature attacked their camp. When they all drove to the site, they found the campfire blazing again, but they couldn't find the other hunter. Quote, "They took the hunter down to the police station, and only in the strong light did they see the claw marks that ran straight down the hunter's back trunk. The next day, they searched again for the missing hunter, but they never found him." Is anyone else noticing some interesting similarities between this story and the well-known urban legend, the Hook Man? It kind of makes sense, as the Hook Man urban legend became incredibly popular in the 50s and 60s, and this story is smack in the middle. This story might be their actual report, but I think it might be interesting to look into some urban legends and their impacts on the public at large. But for now, back to the devil. In the same year, bizarre cries and strange tracks terrorized the town of Dorothy near Mays Landing. Game warden Joseph Gallo and state game trapper Carlton Adams investigated. The official explanation was that the sounds were from owls and hawks, the tracks from a large rabbit, but no one was convinced. Locals were quite familiar with the wildlife around their town, and this wasn't a believable explanation to them. In the summer of 1963, the Trenton Times reported that 5 young men decided to have a Jersey Devil hunt, entering the Pine Barrens near Lake Addison near Bastow, known as a favored spot of the monster. They found 11-inch long tracks and reported screams, quote, "like a pack of wild dogs," and, quote, "like the crazy screams of some cult worshippers." For this next incident, all animal lovers, particularly dog lovers, prepare yourselves. In April of 1966, Stephen Silcoch had property and a farm out near the Mullica River. The poor man had no idea of the massacre he was about to walk into. He found 31 ducks, 3 geese, 4 cats, and 2 large dogs, all mangled to death. In particular, one of those dogs was a 90-pound German Shepherd. Its collar had been chewed to pieces, throat torn open, and the body dragged a quarter mile away. The New Jersey State Police from Tuckerton was sent to investigate. Trooper Al Potter found tracks larger than a human hand leading into the woods along the Mullica River, but they couldn't be casted as the ground was wet. The blame fell on wildcats, bears, and most frustratingly, quote, "supernaturally large raccoons." This guy lost 40 animals. Maybe we could take this seriously? Trooper Al Potter commented, quote, "With all the homicides we solved, all anybody ever wants to hear about is the Jersey Devil." The chief of police of Plumstead Township, Ocean County, Edward Early, had 2 particularly interesting Jersey Devil incidents. One was in the summer of 1966, when he received a frightened call from a family who said that the Jersey Devil was prowling their backyard, leaving hoofprints on the ground. Officer Early was content to brush this off as a combination of horse prints mixed with the fear of the dark, but he was a bit jarred at just how terrified the family was. They all slept with baseball bats in their hands that night. The next incident he was a part of was in 1967. 2 men and a woman were walking through the woods when they saw a beast with the head of a pig. Officer Early arrived on the scene to find 3 terrified witnesses, but no Jersey Devil. Once word of this sighting spread, a little bit of history repeated itself. Many people in Hanover Township refused to go out at night. Parents pressured Early to publicize any other sightings so that they could be forewarned if they needed to keep their children in at night. In 1969, sportsman Edward Corman of Ocean City established the Jersey Devil Association in order to raise funds and track the monster down. Quote, "To those who laughed at his efforts, Corman declared that no myth could survive this long without there really being something out there, somewhere. In the early 1970s, officers of the West Windsor Township Police were returning from a call along Route 539 when they saw a mother and her young daughter standing by a car alongside the road. When they stopped to check on them, the hysterical mother said, quote, "A creature had darted out of the woods, seized a handful of the child's hair, and disappeared into the woods again." Some people disbelieved the story. However, as one of the policemen said, quote, "People can laugh all they want to, but the hair was pulled out of the child's head." Historian Alex Platt of Jackson Township spent over 20 years collecting stories of the Jersey Devil, and this next incident came from his records. Quote, Platt also relates a story of something in the swampy thicket along Cook Road in Jackson that periodically disturbed the neighborhood dogs around 1973. A strange thrashing in the swampy water caused the frightened dogs to bark wildly. About the same time, an undetermined number of large dogs were mysteriously mauled at different locations between Watertown and Forked River. Strange footprints were found around many of the carcasses. Mr. Platt asserts that most of the sightings he has come across have taken place in or near water, as if the Jersey Devil wanted to hide his trail. In the fall of 1974, Howard Mosley of Whiting was sitting in a boat on Reed's Bay off of Brigantine. At dawn, Mosley was looking for ducks when he saw an incredibly bizarre animal on shore, about 200 yards away. The thing had a kangaroo-like lower body and the upper torso tapering into something like a goat, but most bafflingly, it was perched on its hind legs. The creature was tailless and only weighed about 90 pounds. It gave a loud snort and hopped off into the underbrush. We have another report from historian Alex Platt from 1975. Quote, "A young man who was driving home late one night along Fisher Boulevard in Toms River. As he cruised along, a 6-foot, hairy creature jumped out in front of the young man's car. The young man was badly shaken, but having just passed a police car, he turned around and sped back to the policeman, who returned with him to the scene. The policeman, with some nonchalance, directed the young man to stay in the car while the officer went into the woods with a flashlight to investigate. It was a short wait. Soon the officer ran from the woods in an obvious state of panic and jumped into the young man's car. Though the young man broke speed limits leaving the scene, there wasn't a murmur of complaint from his passenger. He suffered nightmares for many weeks after this incident, though he felt lucky to have escaped unscathed." There's a handful of testimonies where the stories sound more like Bigfoot than the Jersey Devil. I specifically didn't include any that really implied a hairy humanoid creature, in particular a few stories where the creature doesn't have a tail. But this one, it toes the line in between. In the November of 1976, a notable number of pigs were found dead around Pedrickton. Some of the causes of death were easily identified as cholera, but there were others where their cause of death couldn't be determined. And then there were others that had been mutilated. At least one had been carried away by something unknown, a trail of blood dragged through the bushes, but most of the bloody leaves were 3 feet off the ground. Quote, "At this time in the nearby Carney's Point area, Ray Smallwood observed the mayhem taking place among some local livestock. Several 110 to 115-pound pigs, not fully grown, appeared to have been lifted out of their pens and dragged 500 yards. Their throats were eaten out, and claw marks scored their backs and shoulders. Mysterious footprints were found in the area. In addition to Smallwood, the people on whose farm the mutilations took place were witnesses. After the wife saw the big creature with the long tail run across the road, she carried a gun when she worked on the farm." In the summer of 1977, a woman was driving in Penn's Grove when a large, hairy beast dashed to her car and grabbed her door handle. She drove off, terrified to find that the monster was able to run alongside her car, up to 60 miles per hour. In June 1978, quote, real estate agents had trouble selling or even leasing a house south of Manahawkin along Route 9. Several prospective buyers and renters backed out of deals after seeing a large red monster with bat-like wings and an alligator tail. At 1 a.m. on December 12, 1978, an anonymous informant was driving from Chatsworth. It being December and dark out, he was driving down the center of the road as a precaution against any deer that may run out into his path. Quote, yet to the man's surprise, a deer flew out of the air at a supernaturally high arc and dropped straight down onto the windshield and hood of his car. He fought to bring the car, which was traveling at 50 miles per hour, to a stop. To this day, the man believes that the deer was possessed by the Jersey Devil when it jumped 25 feet in the air. This prominent, respected citizen is convinced the Jersey Devil has the power to excite animals to do supernatural feats. In another instance in the late 1960s, a deer charged a long distance before crashing through the door of a Pinelands school. This anonymous gentleman refers to the Jersey Devil as, quote, the Prince of the Pine Barrens, and he adds that the creature can possess people as well as animals. He believes the Jersey Devil is an evil spirit that has no form of its own, but moves into the bodies of animals or humans. This may account for the many varied descriptions in the legend. Summer 1979. Officer Edward O. Herbert, Jr. of the Ocean County's Sheriff Department and a number of others independently saw a large, mountain lion-like cat around Miller Air Park in Berkeley Township. Herbert was stopped by a visitor from Africa. This visitor asked Herbert if he realized a lion was roaming about, as he recognized the tracks. Herbert drove over to the Great Adventure Park, thinking it may be an escaped animal, but they had no wild animals missing. Some residents even armed themselves and investigated the woods, but whatever it was gone. In the fall of the same year, quote, a hunter shot a deer that had long, deep claw marks down its back, as though a predator of considerate size had grabbed it. The hunter told Herbert that either the lion had returned or these claw marks were the work of the Jersey Devil. This next bit of information is another example of how locals were viewed, particularly when it came to their belief in the Jersey Devil. In 1981, the Canadian newspaper The National Examiner published an article titled, quote, Revealed, Demon Roams New Jersey Coast. Floyd West, mayor of Bass River Township and member of the Pinelands Commission, gave a quote for the March 24 issue. Quote, the loathsome fiend actually breeds with local women, who then give birth to half-human, half-demon children. Quote, women who have carnal knowledge of the Jersey Devil produced monstrous, evil children. The citizens of Bass River Township didn't like this disgusting public statement from a man who was supposed to represent them. They demanded his resignation, but they weren't done yet. Citizens placed signs all along Route 9 in their fury. One sign read, quote, Welcome to Demonsville, land of satanic pleasure. Devil made us do it. Many were torn down, but others were saved and reset on private lawns. Mayor West quickly backpedaled. Quote, I didn't think people believed what they read in those rags. He went on to claim that the article was a pure fabrication. Quote, I never gave the Examiner an interview. I had no contact with them at all. I don't even buy any of those newspapers. The whole thing is made up of thin air. This controversy eventually passed with time, but the people of the Pines had been heard loud and clear. They weren't going to sit idly by if anyone was going to call them monsters as well. September 1992. Jode Hillman was fishing with friends in the Pine Barrens. They caught sight of 7 to 8 deer in a clearing, watching them serenely graze.
So we got to the spot we were going to fish. We stopped and we looked over to our right and we saw a group of 7 to 8 deer feeding in a little clearing. And as we were looking at the group of deer, just all of a sudden we saw this animal come ripping into the herd of deer and just sent them scattering in every direction. It wasn't moving in an undulating motion like something running across the ground would be doing. It was moving in a straight, linear fashion. These deer were running for their lives. They were frightened. It made the hair on the back of my neck stand up, and it just really gave me, kind of an unsettled feeling. I saw very much something that I can't understand, that I don't know what it was. It's burned into my memory for as long as I live.
In December of 1999, Summer Park Ranger of the Wharton State Forest of New Jersey, John Irwin, quote, was patrolling at night when he noticed a large, dark figure emerging from the woods. It stood like a human, over 6 feet tall, and had black fur that looked wet and matted. The Forest Service report of the incident went on to state, quote, John sat in his car only a few feet away from the monster. His initial shock soon turned to fear when the creature turned its deer-like head and stared through the windshield. But instead of gazing into the bright yellow glow of a deer's eyes, John found himself the subject of a deep glare from 2 piercing red eyes. But I also have some secondhand stories for you all as well. Tony Hulse told his granddaughter Alice Haley of Monmouth Beach stories of the Jersey Devil from when he was a young boy. Though he passed away in 1950, at 96 years old, Alice remembers his stories. One of those stories goes, quote, he was walking home from the local Baptist church during a heavy rain. Thinking he heard a galloping horse a short distance behind him, he moved to the side of the road. As the animal came into view, Hulse realized it was no ordinary horse. Quote, this horse was 10 times as large and breathing fire and smoke. My grandfather dashed for the closest tree, quickly climbing it to a branch out of danger. Very frightened, he waited until all was quiet again, glad that his home was not far off. Hulse returned to the site later and discovered large footprints in the muddy road. He shoveled one of them up with a wide board and put it on display in the general store in Osborneville. This next story is a bit cartoonish, but still worth telling nonetheless. Quote, one night, a farmer heard strange sounds in his barnyard. He dashed out the door in time to see something dark running alongside his barn. The farmer blasted the creature with a shotgun, and in the morning, he found the 7-foot-tall silhouette of the Jersey Devil on the side of the barn, precisely shaped by the shotgun pellets that he'd sprayed around the creature's body. The silhouette perfectly matched the local description of the monster: a kangaroo shape, a deer head, short front feet, long back feet, and wings. It was also believed that the prints left by the Jersey Devil resembled those of a deer, and that it had a bushy porcupine tail with long end needles, which acted as an effective deterrent against any foolhardy individuals who might attempt to seize the beast by its tail. Now we go from a kind of tall tale to more of a ghost story from Elizabeth Lang of Moorestown, whose family passed this story along for generations. A farmer from Millsville had a large field surrounded by woods where he grew corn. One year, he noticed that a row of corn had been consumed, with strange footprints scattered about. Annoyed at this nightly assault, he, his 14-year-old son, and a neighbor decided to camp out and catch the thief. At dusk, each man and child carried a lantern and filed into the fields. The group became separated as a dense fog rolled in. The farmer heard blood-curdling screams from somewhere behind him, which he pursued. Finally, he made out 2 lanterns bobbing in the wind, but as he got closer, he saw they were both hanging unattended on the lower branches of a tree. Out of the fog, something tall and dark with huge wings swooped down on him, knocking him to the ground. He felt wings brush his face and smelled the cutting scent of sulfur. He fled home in a panic, spending the rest of his night quaking in his house. The next morning, the neighborhood searched for the missing son and neighbor, but they only ever found those 2 lanterns, still hanging in the branches. Everyone had no doubt that the Jersey Devil had taken its victims. More recently, some have seen the Jersey Devil fly over their car on the Garden State Parkway or on one of the sandy roads through the pines. Countless expeditions have searched for the creature. Numerous television shows have trekked through the pines. The secret history of the Jersey Devil reads, quote, "As a friend of ours recently quipped, if there was a Jersey Devil in the Vinelands, it surely would have been run over by now by a tour bus roaring along the Garden State Parkway en route to Atlantic City." Now that's a ton of Jersey Devil sightings. It's definitely up there in terms of sheer numbers, and yet a crazy variety of encounters and events. But it doesn't just end with a long list of incidents. No. Remember, where people saw a monster, if not an icon of the area, other people saw opportunity. And so follows a list of hoaxes, some of which definitely account for some of these sightings. Then we get to talk about theories, from demons, to witches, to misidentified wildlife, and more. And finally, the legacy that remains. So come back next week for our thorough conclusion of the Jersey Devil.